This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 510th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. This episode of Helping Writers Become Authors is brought to you in partnership with Podtone. If you're a podcaster who's struggling or unsure about your recording quality, or if you need help editing, mixing, or mastering your podcast, you can visit the team who works with me every week at podtone.com or drop them an email at info@podtone.com to get started today. So I'm in a bit of a cram mode for the rest of the month after realizing that I wasn't quite as far ahead of schedule as I thought in editing the book that I hope to see published later this year, Writing Your Story's Theme. My goal is to finish editing it by the end of June and have it available for my beta readers and reviewers throughout the rest of the summer, while I hit it hard with formatting and proofreading. If all goes well, I'm shooting for a November or December launch. And now, I hope you enjoy this week's episode, which is titled The 3 Acts of a Writer's Life, or How Your Age Affects Your Writing. I have been writing consistently since I was 12, which means I've now been writing for 22 years. In that time, almost as much about my writing and my relationship with it has changed as has remained the same. This is something I've been casually pondering for a while now. And then last week I received the following email from David Hall, who said, "Down the street, I can see 70 years coming toward me. A few more months and it will be impossible to avoid. Have you ever discussed age and how it affects the material we write?" So, for starters, let me say that this is one of my favorite types of email to receive, those sent to me by older writers who are either just starting out or are still going strong. With this year's birthday, I will reach the moment in my life where 50 is as near to me in the future as 20 is in the past. And since I still feel like a 17-year-old who somehow was given a fake ID, I'm experiencing a mild case of shock over this realization. It is deeply inspiring to me to realize, thanks to these authors, how much can yet be accomplished in the years still before me. I'm also beginning to realize that whatever those years bring, I will almost certainly be surprised by their offerings. Certainly the effects and my experiences as a writer are vastly different to me now as an adult than they were when I was a child. Indeed, since I never expected things to change at all in that regard, the differences I've encountered have all been tremendous surprises, sometimes disturbing, sometimes delightful. Although at present I can offer only a limited amount of personal insight into how your age affects your writing, no doubt David could offer a good deal more himself, since I was asked, I thought it might be a fun topic to explore. This is especially so in light of the fact that the readers who frequent my site and those who listen to this podcast present a vast variance in age, and also because this is inevitably a topic that touches us all. Interestingly enough, this idea of life evolution and how age affects our perspective of and impact on life is one I've been exploring lately from the lens of story theory. As I've teased a few times, I'm currently wrapping up research for a new series for the blog and podcast that will explore successive archetypal character arcs, which are representative of the seasons, or acts, of life. So as a sneak peek, since it ties in with today's subject, I believe we see the pattern of story structure's 3 acts played out in the typical human lifetime, in which approximately 30 years comprises each act. The first act, roughly our first 30 years, is largely about defining our relationships with ourselves and our own personal identities. When the archetypal arcs of those years are properly completed, they lay the foundation for healthy arcs in the following acts. The second act, made up of roughly the next 30 years, is focused on our relationships with others, friends, mates, children, community. And finally, the third act, what for most of us will be the last 30 or so years in this life, then becomes the climactic act, which focuses on our relationship to life and death itself in all their transcendent mystery. Even though I began studying these life arcs as a way to further develop my understanding of how to structure my characters' arcs in the most resonant way, the reason these arcs are archetypal is because they necessarily first apply to our own lives. And because I can already see the first and now the second acts playing out in my life, I believe the archetypal principles of the third will ring true as well. So, without further ado, the writing of youth, writing to ourselves. Why we write when we're young. In both my young self and in the many young writers with whom I regularly interact, I see the ebullient joy of creation simply for creation's sake, and a sort of desperation, as represented in Jo March's statement from the 1994 film adaptation of Little Women, where she said, "Late at night, my mind would come alive with voices and stories and friends as dear to me as any in the real world. I gave myself up to it, longing for transformation." We start writing for the pure joy of it, whether it is the joy of fantasizing ourselves into the midst of miraculous adventures, or the cathartic joy of our angst poured out in characters who are deeply intimate projections of ourselves. When we are young, writing is an exploration. I dare say the young dislike the stricture that we should write what we know more than any of us. After all, the only things we know at that age are what we write. And we write all kinds of things: fantasy, romance, adventure, even serious social dramas. We are perhaps never more derivative than in the beginning, as we begin inhabiting and owning the stories of others, which have first carried us away with ourselves. But we are also perhaps never more original than at this age, when everything is new. When I look back at the stories I wrote in my first act, there is a special freshness and passion within their rawness and clumsy technique. For all that my adult novels are technically better, they are not stories I inhabit in the same way I did those early ones. We write like Jo March, scribbling madly away into the night. However much we may desire the approval and enjoyment of early readers, we write these stories for ourselves. We write not because it's a job, not because we've made it a goal to show up at the desk every day, but because we want to. We write ourselves bleary into the night and think it the greatest fun of all. We write with varying degrees of control and technique. If we pursue our writing diligently as time rolls on, we begin to discover that writing is not simply the breathing of one's soul upon the page. It is indeed the art of communication, and that however innately talented or imaginative we believe ourselves, we aren't actually that good at it. The angsty teenage years then began in earnest, affecting our writing as much as anything else, and we began to take it all very seriously. And then we come to the writing of adulthood, which is about writing to others. Well into my 20s, I insisted I wrote for myself and that I would continue to write even if I knew no one would ever read what I wrote. Although I still mostly stand by that, I have witnessed a distinct change in myself here in my mid-30s. My second act has seen me grieve for and grapple with the fallen expectation that my relationship to my writing would always be as ecstatic as it was in my first act. More than that, I've surprised myself by realizing that not only do I now write as much for others as for myself, but that it is important to me to do so. If writing in the first act was all about my joy in expressing and exploring myself, writing in my second act has brought with it the increasing awareness of my responsibility in relating with others, and indeed my great desire to use writing to have a positive impact on my world. There's no such thing as just a story. This statement began in my 20s as a passionate defense of the idea that my stories were an important part of my life, but has since transmogrified into an even more passionate belief that every word we write, fictional or not, is a catalyst either for good or for ill. The blaring passion of our early stories gives way to a more deliberate pursuit of meaningful resonance and purposeful originality. Although we may well have just one story to tell and go on telling it over and over again in different ways, we grow significantly more refined in our execution. The type of stories we tell may change entirely. The more ground we cover, the more we may branch out, experimenting with how to share our enduringly passionate truths in original ways that avoid treading the same ground. We become more conscious of the symbolism and themes that populate our stories. We understand what we are writing more clearly, to the point that ideas we would have blithely written about in the first act are now rejected or perhaps just honed. If we're writing professionally, we're also writing for others, not just as a communal whole, but as customers. We're constantly trying to find that balance between the old youthful enthusiasm, the demands and desires of the market, and our own purposeful convictions about the nature of art. In my experience of the second act so far, that is the hardest balance to perfect. For those of us who began writing in our first act, we have the blessing of years of experience and learning behind us at this point. We've made mistakes and learned from them, both in style and in process. We're perhaps at the stage of knowing what we know. But that same experience that allows us to easily avoid the beginner's mistakes can also lead us to burnout and repetitive fatigue. Some of the methods that served us well in the first blush of youthful passion no longer come as easily. We have to reconnect with the inner child, with the deep motivations that brought us to writing in the first place. We have to learn how to harmonize the child and the adult into a new synthesis that is built upon the past, but also completely different from what we may have taken for granted would always be our own particular creative experience. And that brings us to the writing of age, in which we write to the universe. As we enter the third act, I imagine we may well find ourselves having proven to ourselves and to others many of the challenges that seemed so vital in our early acts. There is a return of sorts to the old stomping ground of the first act when we wrote purely for ourselves because we wanted to and because it brought us joy. But now we write from the vantage of long years of experience and knowledge. The passionate stories we wrote as children were questions we asked of the life that lay before us. Many of those questions have now found their answers. Now it is something else that lies before us and new questions that our stories must ask. So I imagine we write both for ourselves to ask these larger questions, but also for others to leave to them some of the answers we have found. I think there is a period late in the first act and throughout most of the second when we care zealously about how our writing will be received and what sort of impact it may make on our readers. But I also think that at a certain point we don't care as much. Authors in their third act aren't as rigorous with their form anymore. They began experimenting more. They are asking questions again rather than just filling in the expected answers. And these questions show up in how they treat the actual process of writing as much as anything else. There is a playfulness that may not have been fully present previously. Also, I see in many older authors a deeper passion than ever before. Their time is limited. Their own life stories are coming to a close. They have only so much longer to share the stories that are important and to give the following generations of both readers and writers the truths they have won in their own hard-fought battles. If our third act sees us sometimes more playful than we have allowed ourselves to be before, it may also see us more intense than ever. After a lifetime of writing, or even just a lifetime of living, come to that, there's a good deal of instinct that naturally flows through us. Techniques we struggled with in the first and second acts are long since mastered. If story itself remains an affectionately unruly beast, it is perhaps one we no longer view with the same frustrated suspicion we sometimes did in our earlier life. Perfection may both come more easily and in some measure be less important. We're now writing less because we have something to prove to the world, and more because we have something to share. So in closing this episode, I realize even more than when I began it that I am massively unqualified to have shared it, since more than half of my ideas about it are total conjecture. Still, it has been a thought-provoking exercise and roused a hopefully not too idealistic anticipation of what the rest of my second act and all of my third act will bring for me as a writer. Since we are all at different points in our life stories, I hope you will stop by the website and share your own insights into how age affects your writing, both in its challenges and its opportunities. If you'd like to be a part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to support helping writers become authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.